No? Am I live now? There we go. Awesome. Well, welcome everybody to Gallup. We're very excited to host you. Mimi, thank you, and Accenture, thank you for making this possible. Doug, thank you for your leadership of this organization. Can't say how important an organization like this is. I'd like to just make a couple quick remarks about where we are today and why I think it kind of makes a point about how important leadership is in today's world. So this is the Gallup Great Hall. Today it's called the Gallup Great Hall, but it was actually built in the mid-1800s. I think the historians have told us that Ford Theater is right over there. When Lincoln was assassinated, this building was under construction, so there would have been scaffolding out front. He probably maybe even drove down or rode his horse down the road on the way to the show that night at the Ford Theater. It was shortly after that completed, and it was actually the first Washington Convention Center, this building that we're in today. And we can say that when Grant was president at the time, that there was actually a presidential ball held right here in this building, from that wall to this wall on this floor. So this Great Hall has real historical significance for America and for Washington, D.C. But I think it also makes a point when you think about how small this is, from that wall to that wall, that a presidential ball was held in here. Think about how simple leadership was back then. But you think about the leadership that's required today, I think we'd all agree that the world's never been more complex than it is at this very moment. And so, I don't know if you guys have ever heard this before, but one of the most important parts about leadership is getting your premises right. Because if you're one of the best leaders in the world, if you're dynamic, if you're energizing, if you can organize people, influence people, develop people, if you have your premises wrong on what exactly you want to accomplish as a leader, the more you lead, the worse you can make whatever that organization or place is that you're trying to lead. So Gallup, as a data organization today, there's a lot of conversations out there about big data and how it's changing the world. But we still have a massive challenge, which is how do you take data and how do you get to the right insight? Or how do you get your premise right before you lead? And so I thought I'd just share a really quick story that's relevant to world leadership and to Gallup that makes the point. After 9/11, Donald Rumsfeld would have been real popular at the time, being interviewed by the press. Someone raises their hand and asks him, they said, why did 9/11 happen? And he kind of takes him as a question that he wasn't expecting. He kind of goes, well, I don't have any idea. What do you think? I have a Gallup poll on that? Well, so Gallup, up until that time, we had done some sporadic international polling, but never anything at scale. Today, we're actually doing an annual survey in 140 plus countries around the world that we think really kind of quantifies what's going on in society. But there was an idea born right at that moment. Our chairman and CEO, Jim Clifton, sitting at home on a Saturday, listening to the interview over coffee, and goes, starts typing and calling furiously to our team and say, can we do an international poll? I mean, if you don't have a Gallup poll on that to understand exactly what was the thoughts and the thoughts and hearts of people all around the world on a really important leadership thing. So we put our teams on it. We got a huge survey. I don't know if you remember this. Everybody here is probably from Washington. But there's a huge conversation here after 9/11 about why it happened. It happened because they hate us for our freedom. I was actually here at the time, and I remember that. And well, they hate us for our freedom, so that's that. So all the leadership is taking that premise, they hate us for our freedom, and then trying to fix it through that lens. So we went out and did our thing. Maybe you guys know where this is going, but we asked the entire Muslim world just one question: what do you admire about America? What do you guys think the answer was? The number one thing actually was technology. They admire us for our technology. But the number two thing right behind that was our freedom. But just think about that. So there's a narrative, and there's a leadership narrative in Washington saying they hate us for our freedom, but you go ask the people and it's the opposite. So you got to change all your strategies on how you actually approach the problem. So I just say that today, as you guys think through stuff, one of the challenges is how do we make sure we're right? So the more we lead, the better we make the world, America, and Greater Washington. So thank you for being here today.
Joe, thank you very much. All right, we're going to get started with Bob Buchanan from the 2030 Group. Bob, come on up. Bob's been the fan of the organization, has been the head of it, and really has brought a lot of research and clarity, I think, to where we should be going as a region and what we should be doing and what are the, putting some numbers behind what are the challenges that we face. So, Bob, thank you very much.
Thank you, Doug. Let me just start off by saying to pick up on your comments about premise. Last year, Bob McCartney and I were in a conversation before you, and I think regionalism and the prospects for the future of Greater Washington were a little bit iffy. We had a metro issue, we still do. We were really starting to grapple with the roadmap for our regional economy's future, and there really wasn't a sense of cohesiveness that we felt we needed to have if we were going to compete as a region nationally, much less internationally. But what a difference this Amazon HQ2 has meant. The positiveness, the cohesiveness, the pride in what we have, the knowledge of how much a fit our workforce, our capital, our main source of pride, if you will, of our very intelligent, very capable, very skilled workforce, how well it aligns with a company like Amazon's needs for its future workforce. And as one of the organizations called Data Story tried to research what the Amazon HQ2 meant and what kind of workforce they'd be looking for and what our skill sets were here and the attractiveness of this region for that workforce, it was a wow factor for most of us. I think we all stepped back from some of our concerns about our traffic and our affordability, which are still concerns, but we realized that we just might be one of those places for not only an Amazon, but other Amazons as they look to where they can attract the best talent to do what they're doing to change the world. So before I get too far into that, let me just ask, how many people are aware of the roadmap developed by Steve Fuller in 2030 in a collaborative effort of business leaders? Good. How many of you actually have read it? Very good. Very impressive. Well, where are we on that today? Part of that was we need to rebrand ourselves as more than just a federal city, as more than just Capitol Hill, as more than just, when I was growing up, Beltway bandits, contractors, federal contractors. We need to rebrand ourselves. Well, I would argue that the efforts that went into the response to Amazon's bid for HQ2, the response led to a rebranding of this region in a very positive way, which I just spoke about. And the other thing about that rebranding effort was that COG took the initiative, which I thought was excellent on their behalf, took the initiative to generate some of the reports, some of the studies as a region, because we all started to recognize that it doesn't matter if Amazon ends up in Fairfax or Prince George's or DC, the region will benefit. The region will benefit from those 50,000 employees earning the big bucks who would move here. They're not all going to live in one jurisdiction. I personally feel that Amazon may well find an urban setting, much like they have in Seattle, and that may be spread around. It may not be in just one campus, if you will. They like that urban connectiveness that they found in Seattle. So we marketed ourselves through COG's initiative using the information that people like Data Story generated. And each jurisdiction then put out their own site, but they used a lot of the material about why this region is what it is from that COG effort. And I was at the board meeting when some of the materials were being released, and the discussion was a pride from all the elected officials and a sense of we're in this together. That is a huge change from when the 2030 group got started. The word regionalism was not only not discussed, but if you were an elected official, you could not run on a regional platform. You couldn't get reelected. But if you stuck to your local jurisdiction, you would get reelected. Plus, the federal government was doling out more and more money, procurement money, into our local economy. So local officials were telling me, Buchanan, you may be talking about the need for regional priorities, for infrastructure, for transportation. You may be talking all these grandiose things regionally, but guess what? I got more money this year than I got last year, and I'll probably get more money next year. So why do I want to do anything big and hard? Plus, I won't get reelected. So thank you very much, not interested. Then a little thing called sequestration happened. Then Steve Fuller started talking about this job growth that we had been getting from the federal government was going to flatten, and he had the figures to back it up. How do we change that? And interestingly, last night I heard comments by Ereban Basu, who was talking about the local economy and talking about where we were today. And I asked him, I said, you know, every time I open up the Business Journal, Washington Business Journal, I got to give him a plug because every issue that I open, I am astounded at the number of companies I've never heard of. I'm astounded at the players and the types of companies and the types of business they're in. Very entrepreneurial, very strong. This isn't the economy that I was used to. And witness Cisco's buying Broadsoft or something like that. I don't even know the name of the company. This last week for $1.9 billion. That's pretty impressive. We're generating these companies. We're doing a great job of diversifying. It may not be fast enough, and Steve Fuller would say we're still not getting the job growth at the higher end that we need, but we are on a path to do that. But I have to say that we still are very dependent on the federal government. And I have to say that Ereban Basu, to my question about are we developing a local economy per the roadmap as you think we should, and his comment was federal government is going to implode given the funds for Social Security, for Medicare. Things are going to change. Things have to change. You can't rely on that as much as we have. We have a lot of people who are still employed by the federal government. It's how we respond to the federal government's needs that will determine our ability to be this great place that we all are so proud of. So I think we need to continue to be very much involved in regional leadership. We need to continue to, and not depend on the federal government to bail out Metro, et cetera. We need to be far more proactive on our infrastructure needs. I was very proud that Governor Hogan came out with a huge, bold initiative. Fix the Maryland Beltway, fix 270, take over the Baltimore-Washington Parkway from the Park Department, Interior, and expand it. Wow. When have we had leaders in Maryland, anyway, be that progressive, be that bold, and not just focused on transit? So I see a lot of good things that the roadmap has started. I see this effort, Doug talking about other leadership organizations starting to meet regularly, starting to interact. And I think we have, and been blessed with, the human capital, proximity to the federal government, a quality of life due to the cultural aspects of this region, we can attract the talent. That was a key premise of the roadmap. You need to attract the talent, but we need to retain it. And the retaining the talent is going to be difficult if we don't really get on our infrastructure needs, if we don't really address housing affordability. My personal hope is that this region makes round 2 with Amazon's HQ2. But if I were Amazon, I'd come to this region and say, you're going to be very seriously considered, Greater Washington, but cut the BS about Metro. What are you really doing? And Governor, are you going to be able to pull off these public-private partnerships for your road infrastructure? Everyone's saying it was a political move. You don't have the lane width. You don't have the right-of-way. And housing affordability. You're going to hear more about that from David Bowers. And he's got a great group going, and there's a lot of positive things coming out. But when has this region, as a region, ever tried to put its arms around something that's difficult as land use issues, and housing affordability ties right into that? I was talking to the head of Marriott when I was involved in Marriott's relocation, and his comment was, a couple of years ago, our biggest obstacle to retaining talent and hiring talent was the transportation system that we all know is broken. He said, but as of the last couple of years, housing affordability is right there with it. So we've got what it takes. We need to have the will, we need to have the ability to keep talking, because where there's a will, there's a way. And I'm very pleased that we're starting to act in that fashion. So let me stop and take on some questions, because last year, I remember the questions were the best part of the whole scenario for me. In the back.
So I'm glad that my name is Terry Copeland. I am LGW class of 2015 and part of the board of directors. And I'm glad you're raising the challenges that we're facing in order to be competitive for Amazon, including the transportation and, more importantly for me, the affordability of housing. And I want to know, with those grand and looming challenges that we've been trying to address for probably decades now, and the timing of Amazon's decision, which I am not clear on that, how does that intersect? Like, how long do we have to try to come up with solutions to be competitive in this process?
Amazon, I don't think Amazon expected to get 232 responses. So their time factor or their schedule may be a little bit changed. But I was under the impression that as of the first of the year, after the first of the year, they were going to come out with some of their selections, and I'm sure there's going to be another round. I think they were planning to make their final decision by late spring, early summer, because one of the criteria is they need 500,000 feet to be occupied, ready for them for their first tranche of move-ins in 2019. So the timing is
not on our side.
Timing is not on our side. We got, as much as I'd love to see the Metro thing solved between now and April, I think we're going to have to make some commitments. So, and as Doug Duncan, I was laughing with Doug earlier. Doug was on some Channel 4 this last week when talking about the Amazon experience and Metro, and he said, Metro is not going to be a problem. If Amazon says they're coming, Metro's going to have all the money they need. So let's get by that one. But and that's so a big if.
Part two of my question is, you did mention also that, in terms of our challenge in retaining talent here, we are seeing an exodus of millennials at a rapid pace because of the lack of affordability and transportation issues and all of those things we're talking about. And if that is the case, would we then again be attractive to an Amazon if the talent that they're looking to attract is not staying because we have all those other challenges?
Well, I think that's, in a way, I think that's the question we have to start addressing. I think we have started to say to ourselves, we do have an awful lot going for us, but if we're not proactive on those things that are challenging us, then we're not going to be the place we need to be. And I have to compliment some other regions like Indianapolis, Indiana, and some of these other regions that are really don't have the government to back them up. They have to do it themselves. They have to give each other their back, so to speak. And hopefully our sense of regionalism is starting to get to that point now, where there are more people at the table. And the public-private partnerships are going to be, I think, what's going to make the difference for us. Any other questions? Hi.
Hi, I'm Paula Rothenberg, Leadership Washington class of 2000. I live in Virginia. I run a DC corporation with facilities in Montgomery County and Prince George's County.
Good.
I think we have so much to offer here, but when I sit in the chamber meetings in Montgomery County and in Prince George's County, the regional collaboration, especially when it comes to Amazon, is not there. They're going to dig in deep to bring it to their region. How do we foster that regional collaboration?
Well, I will take issue with some of that you said, because as chair of the Montgomery County Economic Development Corporation, I work with COG for COG to come out with the regional information. And for me, it is a regional win for anybody if HQ2 comes here. But I also think the effort taught us that if it's not Amazon, it's going to be another company. It may not be as big, but we need to be proactive. We have to be proactive. And so this little fiefdom about, I'm used to only pushing my jurisdiction, I think is a loss to the region. I think hopefully the leaders, the elected leaders, have risen above that. And yes, some of the economic development directors, their job depends on them generating, the attraction of businesses, retention of businesses, et cetera. But I think we all know at the end of the day, if we're fixing things as a region, that benefits everybody. And God knows the negative press we've had about the Metro mess, and Emeka's going to talk to some of the things that Federal City Council has been the leadership on for the Metro Coalition, Metro Reform Coalition. That hadn't happened before, where business organizations are starting to say, enough, we got to start fixing that. We fouled our nest, we got to clean it up. And I think a year ago, I wouldn't have said that this would happen as quickly as it is, nor would I have thought that Metro would be dangling in the wind as long as it has. But I do feel maybe the Metro crisis didn't unite us, but HQ2 sure as heck has done a lot more for our sense of ourselves and what we need to do than anything I can think of. So I think we're past that. In fact, I got to make a comment. Chuck Bean, who, again, I praised Washington Business Journal. Now I'm going to say you made a big mistake by not including Chuck Bean on your Power 100 yesterday. He came out, he and I were talking about the Amazon experience, and his comment really was very telling. He said, for anybody who thought our regional economy was pretty much like it was in the 90s or maybe even the early 2000s, dead wrong. You look at what we're doing today, you look at what's the phenomena of the cloud and what it's done to Northern Virginia. Jeff Kazmarek is here from Prince William. You look at the dynamics of the IT and the collaborative efforts between cyber and IT in health care, health services. Holy smokes, didn't know there was that much connection in there. We're part of that. We're making that happen. There's a lot to say about this economy going forward that you couldn't have said 5-10 years ago. And we're on the cutting edge of it. And let's hope it continues to go, and let's hope we're all smart enough to keep up with it, because there's some things happening in my long career that I have never experienced before with, forget the word millennial, just the disruptive economy. I mean, it's amazing. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Kevin Reggie, class of 13, Leadership Greater Washington. The Washington Business Journal ran a big spread recently about the Amazon opportunity. And one of the things that was pointed out in that article, which I found interesting and I'd like you to address, is this notion that a big company like Amazon already has a pretty good idea of what they need in terms of infrastructure and transportation and train routes and all the rest, in terms of where they need to locate their second headquarters. And that the rest of it, essentially, is a bidding war, meaning that when they have that one or two or three choices that they've really narrowed down based on their internal needs, that the rest becomes an opportunity for essentially a transfer of dollars and other sweeteners to that corporation, even though the corporation has already decided. Certainly, there are in no way dozens and dozens and dozens of choices for Amazon, but those choices allow a company like Amazon to essentially bid up the cost for a municipality or a state to bring that company in.
So when the Marriott decision was made and the press got some of the incentive given to Marriott to relocate and stay in Montgomery County, you know, there were a lot of political leaders saying corporate welfare, we didn't need to do any of that, yada, yada. I give Amazon enormous credit for doing what they did. Yes, they may be bidding it up. Yes, some of us who were in the process, and I was very involved in the package Montgomery County put together and very involved with the state, the impact of what an Amazon brings to a region in dollars is huge, just huge. And forgetting the PR factor, just as Steve Fuller talks about, the benefits of a six-figure wage earner moving into your area and working in your area. So the collateral impact is huge. And I don't get into the incentive world because I am a commercial developer. I am used to negotiating with businesses moving into my buildings. They all have different needs. They all have different hot buttons. We don't know what Amazon's will be. I'd like to think it's proximity to Washington. I'd like to think it's our workforce. I'd like to think it's our quality of life. They may have some things that none of us have maybe prioritized to the extent we will. So I think there's going to be an awful lot of press about all this process, but I see it as the first of a lot more coming. I think if I was Google, if I was Facebook, if I was whatever, I'd be looking at how Amazon did it and seeing maybe I need to be doing this too. So I think that, again, the impact of what we learned about ourselves, about what it takes to compete and what it takes to attract and retain, I think there's an awful lot of positive experience we've enjoyed. So I don't give too much credence to the what ifs and all the articles about things that we don't know enough about yet to get into.
Got time for one more, John.
Sure. Here it comes.
Thank you. Good morning. John Hasenberg, Leadership Washington class of 2007. Maybe as a wrap-up, since we're almost out of time, curious, the title of your talk was not, let's talk about Amazon. It's a fascinating topic, but I'd be curious, other than Amazon or the next big company that may be coming, what other things are on the horizon for you, be they culture, arts, education, what have you? If you could just pick out some other highlights to share, please.
Well, today you're going to hear an awful lot about things that are very much on my horizon. Metro reform is number one, because if we don't get that, we can't really call ourselves a region. Two, you're going to hear about housing affordability from David Bowers. which I've been very fortunate to have been involved with, and I'm very impressed with, again, here's the philanthropic community working with the business and the public sector in a way that hasn't happened before. And we're talking about, again, housing not affordable housing, but housing affordability, because that crosses all lines. And workforce housing is a big deal. And last but not least, certainly, is what Bob Sweeney is going to be talking about our being able to find out more about ourselves as to how we can export more. How can we be more engaged in the global business? And I won't take away any of his big points, but that's almost a sequel to this roadmap, which outlined what we had thought we were, outlined how we couldn't stay that way and how we needed to diversify. The Global Cities Initiative that led to the export initiative that Bob is going to talk about is a direct result of saying to ourselves, can we do this? How, if so, how? And how do we get a public awareness of it? So I think you're going to start to see a lot of different things and initiatives and abilities that we haven't thought about before, and it's all to the positive. So thank you very much. I hope
Bob,
next year
thank you very much.
We're moving ahead.
Bob, thank you. And I got to say, that was a much more positive talk than last year or the year before when I've talked to you before. I'm glad to hear that. That's great. Somebody has faith in the region. That's nice. Next is Bob Sweeney, the head of the Global Cities Initiative, which Bob Buchanan just mentioned briefly. So, Bob, turn it over to you. Thank you.
Speaker, that's good, pretty good, but nice try. Just kidding. I was also, I agree with everything Bob said. He's so great. Bob, let's hear it for Bob again. Especially that part about Chuck Bean being in the Power 100. He's the myth, the man behind a lot of moving parts in this region. And he's, I don't want to say a puppet master, but he is really just moving things around so smartly for us as a region right now. I personally love working with him every day. And to Terry Copeland, I also wanted to say, Bob didn't say this in the answer to your question. I think that I worked very closely on the regional Amazon bid, and I think there's 225 other communities that wish they had our metro problem, quite honestly. And I think that we're going to solve it. Mecca's working every day on it, and it's a hard lift, but it's still a pretty cool asset that our region has that all of those other bidding cities didn't have. Housing affordability, that's another question. So you also heard Bob talk about a lot about Steve Fuller, and whoopsie, that's backwards. That's really backwards. Hold on a second. Do I want to go backwards here? All right, help me. Look at that. So you're all Leadership Washington guys, right? So you already all have your doctorate in regional economics from Stephen Fuller. But like Bob said, and like we say at almost every one of these kinds of meetings, but walk away understanding it or you won't get what the problem is. We were a $4 billion economy in 1980. In 2010, we were an $84 billion or $86 billion economy. The federal government propped up our entire growth for 30 years. And when we got hit with sequestration, we got hit hard. And we went $13 billion, $10 billion, $10 billion. Every year, this major hit to our local economy ended up really hurting us, and it's never going to be back to $86 billion. So we have to figure out, how do we pivot? How do we grow up and do other things other than just the federal government? The same can be said for jobs. After 2010, the rest of the country rebounded. We did fine during sequestration, kind of. The hit wasn't as hard on us as it was for the rest of the country during the recession, but the bounce back has been non-existent in Greater Washington. And the future doesn't look that bright for us. Our growth between now and 2020 lags behind the rest of the country. In fact, this is a premise of why exports are really, really important. This should be alarming to you. We're the 93rd, we rank 93 among the top 100 metro areas in terms of export output. And we can do better. I mean, this is low-hanging fruit. We can do a lot better than this. The last slide I'm going to show you on this kind of piece of it is the fact that in 2010, 40% of our local economy was federal government, federal spending. In 2020, 10 years later, it's down to 30%. It's crippling our economy, and we've got to pivot. So there you go, there you go. Along comes Bob Buchanan, starts the roadmap, starts saying we got to figure this out. What should we do differently? How do we do economic differently? Now, boom, the same time Brookings and JP Morgan are funding 29 cities, $10 million to figure out how do you grow metro areas, local economies, and let them figure out how they pivot away from and share in a global economy. We were the last city picked, so we are 29 out of 29. There are 16 other cities around the world, so this is the group, the COG, the Board of Trade, the Consortium of Universities, made up this illustrious band of people helping me kind of think through how do we grow and export global economy, and how do we become, as a region, more globally fluent. It's a 5-year project. The first phase is focused on exports. Everybody can agree on exports, whether you're Jeff Kaczmarek at Prince William County or Jerry Gordon at Fairfax County. Talking about growing your existing company's base is positive. Nobody cares about that. They do care about when we start talking about Amazon or Marriott, and they want them, obviously, in their counties. The second phase, we'll start focusing on foreign direct investment. The table might get a little bit smaller then, because that's when they start caring, and that's when competition starts kicking in. And then the third phase of the Global Cities Initiative, anyway, is when those 29 cities and 16 international cities start working together and figure out how to trade together. And that's called the Global Cities Exchange. So that 40-person group of board of directors decided and came up with a new model. The old model, how we do economic development in 2016 and before, we focused on chasing whales. Let's see if I can get this to work. There we go. So do you remember going after GE? So, and Kaczmarek, you remember going after GE, and everybody else in this room remembers going after GE? We probably spent, as a region, $5 million chasing GE, and it ended up in Boston. We were close. We were third, I think, in running, maybe even second in running our region to get the GE headquarters deal. Ended up in Connecticut. BMW was kind of the first of these big deals that ended up. We were chasing it. Virginia was chasing it. Maryland was chasing it. And it ended up in South Carolina. One winner, hundreds of losers. Boeing is the same thing. Boeing's was just like Amazon. It wasn't as open as Amazon, but there were 100 cities that applied for the Boeing headquarters deal. And it came down to a select handful, and they ended up picking Chicago. One winner, lots of losers. That is old school economic development. I mean, you could argue that Amazon is kind of old school economic development. The new way is represented by that guy. How many people know Joe? So this is a rock star. This guy has a company called Meg Aviation. He had 100 employees in 2010. He got hit with sequestration, and he got hit hard. He lost 66% of his employees. He's down to 33 employees. He spent his last $100,000 flying to Paris and buying a booth at the Paris Air Show, thinking this was going to turn his company around. And he made every mistake you could make as a CEO. He didn't end up with any meetings. Nothing. He actually left Paris so dejected, and he tripped over a lady in the airport that worked for the Department of Commerce. Literally tripped over. Computer went flying, everything. They got to talking, and she said, "You should talk to the Virginia Economic Development Partnership. They have a great program called Valet. Valet is something that will teach you how to export." And he went home. He did it. Last Wednesday night, we'll say something positive about the Washington Business Journal, because they did make a big mistake about not including Chuck. Last Wednesday night, the 7th fastest growing company in Greater Washington went from 33 employees to 1,500 employees. He takes the Predator drone, which he got a big contract for from the Army, which is the nuclear drone that could hit a kitchen pan in the Kremlin if it wanted to. But it has all this video surveillance stuff. And he can now sell the data that he's getting off the Predator drone as it's flying over Canada and sell it to Canadian DNR for moose migration patterns. Or he sells the same thing in Africa, tracking rhinoceros. It's amazing. I mean, seriously, this is a Predator drone. But it's amazing what he's done with the company turnaround and how he's become now the Virginia Business of the Year because of exports. Everybody knows this, right? How many times do you say this? It's all about your businesses grow, companies create jobs from existing businesses, not chasing Amazon or whales. Let's focus on existing businesses. In our own economy, 450,000 jobs were created by companies that expanded. Look how many moved in and moved out. That's the chasing of whales. You'll lose every time. Open and close, another 235. So if you just focus on existing businesses, we will get the good jobs. That's what we need to focus on. 83%, Governor McAuliffe says it every day if he says it once. 83% of the world's growth is going to happen outside of the United States. We have to marry up our companies with where the growth is. We have to get them to sell internationally. And that's what the Export Center is all about. So the Greater Washington Export Center is one piece of the work plan that came out of the Global Cities Initiative project. It's kind of like a World Trade Center. The idea is it would be housed at the Ronald Reagan building. We're working on getting it funded right now. It would provide trade services, one-on-one hand-holding. There's 3,000 companies in our marketplace that are either under-exporting or not exporting yet that could be. And we need to identify those companies and proactively chase them down and go get them. It's not Jeff Kazmarek's job to do existing business. He goes out and gets companies to move into the county. It's not Jerry Gordon's job. So whose job is it to help existing businesses grow? That's what we have to figure out. And so I propose that it would be this organization's job to go out and figure out who is ripe for growth, who should be exporting that may not be, or who's under-exporting, and help them figure out where their markets are around the world that they can go export. So that's what we're doing. And if you would like to get involved, I would like you to be involved. We're going to be doing trade missions all over the world, helping inbound trade missions as well as hand-holding those companies. So that was a fast 15 minutes, but I got it all in. Any questions? Please, about Amazon. Oh, I will say, so Joe, all we got to do is find 50 Joes, and we've got our Amazon. It's only 50,000 jobs. Yes?
Good morning. Mahan Tavikoli, 98, Leadership Greater Washington. As my daughter says, prehistoric ages.
But you don't say, do you guys have a slogan? Like
we do, the Iconoclasts.
Iconoclast,
yeah. I still remember it. Bob, I think the irony is not lost on anyone in the room that the first presentation focused a lot on a whale, which is Amazon. And your presentation talked about that as being the old way of doing things, and the new way is different. And I wanted to throw one more thing on top of it, is that a part of the challenge in our region is that when we can't get things done through existing entities, we pick up our pieces and go up and start a new organization. So there are lots of different organizations that are going to be talking today, including Greater Washington Partnership. So rather than saying, there is the Greater Washington Board of Trade, people say, no, we can create our own organization, slightly different mission, but after the same objectives. So I would like you to reflect and talk about the old way, the new way, and the different organizations that are all talking about regionalism, but have their own twist on it, and therefore it harms the longer effort.
It's almost like he paid me. I mean, I paid him to ask that question. So I only have 15 minutes, but we can talk for an hour about what's missing in this region about regional organizations and their missions. For example, there used to be a Greater Washington initiative in our region that coordinated the activities of all kinds of economic development issues. And Amazon is a perfect example of what would have been coordinated by something like a Greater Washington initiative. It doesn't exist anymore. No, look at anybody. So what ended up happening was the Board of Trade, the Greater Washington Partnership, the 2030 group, all came together to help COG produce this report. It used to be a single entity being able to do it. Now we have to kind of coordinate amongst many. Nobody in the region is focusing, I take that back. Nobody regionally is focusing on exports. The states have their export offices, but they're, for example, that valet program I talked about earlier that Joe Fluitt went through, 20 companies a year get to go through that in the whole state of Virginia. So maybe 2 from Northern Virginia. It's not making, it's the best in the country, and it's not making an impact really. And so, we'd like to ramp that up. And if we focused on exports, I'll give you one stat. $26 billion a year is what we do in exports regionally in the Greater Washington region. 22 billion of that is services. So we're kind of we don't make a lot of things, but we do architectural engineering stuff really well. All we got to do is find those government contractors and help them export, and we can grow our economy. And nobody else is doing that in our region. So I would love this to be housed in a board of trade or a partnership or, well, where else would it be housed? That's it. And so, but it's not appropriate for the leadership right now in those organizations. Any other question? Awesome. I must have done a really good job putting you to sleep. Awesome. Well, we're good. Thank you, everyone.
And he's getting his member sticker now. There we go. Bob, thank you very much. Okay, Bob has ceded some of his time to David Bowers from Community Enterprise Partners, who is the head of the Housing Leaders Group of Greater Washington. They've been working for almost 2 years now to put together sort of a regional compact regional approach to housing affordability. So, David, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks. All right. Thank you, Doug Duncan. Appreciate it. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, good morning, good morning. First of all, a huge word of thanks to the conveners of today's event. Leadership Greater Washington, I'm class of 09, prime time. It's good to see Leadership Greater Washington and the other leadership organizations coming together to pull this kind of dialogue and conversation together. So thanks to Doug and to all the leadership organizations pulling this together, and to all of you all for being here. So we'll jump right into it, who we are. And I appreciate the elevation by Doug, but want to be clear that we are, in some ways, the Housing Leaders Group of Greater Washington. I wouldn't call myself the leader, per se, just one of a lead convener, one of the co-conveners of it. And so who we are, who is leadership at the Housing Leaders Group of Greater Washington. You'll see up here across sector leaders who wanted to change really the regional conversation about housing affordability. You heard Bob Buchanan talk about it, and really look at this as a quality of life issue and something that relates to the region's economic competitiveness. And so when we think about whether it's the grocery store clerk or the barista or the registered nurse, the new tech grad, really thinking about changing how we think about housing affordability and who thinks about housing affordability in the region. You'll see the driving idea. There was a conversation one day in a conference room with a representative from Citibank, the Council of Governments, the Washington Regional Association of Grant Makers, and I were just kind of sitting around and saying, you know, it's a small town and we're all kind of on the circuit of meetings and convenings. And we said, is there a way that we can have fewer meetings and more impact, right, as it related to this issue? And so that's really how this was born, where we sought to reach out to a cross-sector of usual and non-usual suspects to talk about this idea from various sectors and from various jurisdictions. And so the group really went through this conversation and decided there were three big buckets that we wanted to focus on. One was capital. How do you get more money and better and more creative use of money, public and private sector, on the issue? Land use practices, and reducing cost. So that was really our initial area of kind of buckets. So when we say, why is our work needed? Why are we having this conversation? And so while it may seem obvious, I always like to say sometimes even, you say sometimes you're preaching to the choir, but sometimes even the choir needs to hear the sermon, because they may not always get the obvious, and there are those who aren't in the choir who need to know. Now, the industry standard typically is that a household shouldn't pay more than 1/3 of its income for its housing cost, right? And if you're paying more than 1/3, you're considered housing cost burden. If you pay more than half of your income for your housing costs, you're considered severely cost burden. So if you look at this graph, the dark blue line shows you that there are 378,000 households in our region. That's 17% of all the households in our region are cost burden, meaning they're paying more than 1/3 of their income for their housing cost. Now, some might say, well, it's not so bad in our region because we used to be able to say we've got a really good metro system, really good public transit, and the Housing Plus transit for some is not as bad. But that's 17% of all households are paying our cost burden, and that is a 36% increase, as you see from this data presented by Dr. Lisa Sturdivant to the Housing Leaders Group at our last meeting. The light blue bar is really stark. 186,000 households, that's almost 9% of the households in our region, and that's a 47% increase, are paying more than 50 cents of every dollar they bring in just to keep a roof over their head. So imagine that. I just let that sink in for a second. For every dollar you make, more than half is going just to keep a roof over your head, right? So this is part of the quality of life of why. This gives you a little information by income. You'll see households by income, dark blue, paying more than 30% of their income, light blue, paying more. A couple I want to highlight. If you look even in the $35,000 to $49,000 household, right, 82% of those households are cost burden, and 1/4 are severely cost burden. Half of households making $50,000 to $75,000 are cost burden, 5% severely cost burden. And even in the $75,000 to $99,000 range, you've got 1/4 almost who are cost burden. So again, when you think about quality of life, we have people, there are literally hundreds of thousands of our neighbors, our family members, our coworkers who wake up every morning with a real struggle that they're dealing with. Put it in perspective. When you go back to work, when you go back to your office, start to think about who works with you, how much they make. And when they come into the office, you say, "Good morning, how you doing?" For some people, they answer, "Really?" The real answer, not the polite answer, "Oh, I'm doing good." The real answer is, "Life is hard. I'm struggling just to kind of keep things going." Now, here's from the economic competitiveness part of the conversation. Again, Bob alluded to this. Read data that came from the Fuller Institute, presented by Dr. Sturtevant in our last meeting. The baseline is Washington, D.C. What you want to take away from this is the cost of living in New York and San Francisco is higher than this region. All of these other metro areas, Boston, Seattle, Miami, Philadelphia, Chicago, etc., all of them are less expensive than we are. So when we think about when people are making decisions, companies are making decisions about will they come here, people making decisions, Bob talked about it, am I going to stay here? All of these other metro areas are much less. You'll see even 19, 18, 16%. That's real money, less expensive. So when we talk about why we're doing the work we're doing, this is part of it. There's some headlines, and I want to read actually a couple of quotes. This is not on it. There's an article that said, "Are DC Millennials happy?" This came from the Washington Business Journal in February of this year. "How many would leave the area for the right job?" And here was the quote. "When asked to agree or disagree with, 'I can afford to buy a home in the area,' only those making up $150,000 a year or more agreed, and even when that category, only 51%. The rest disagreed. They disagreed at every income level and in every locality." Imagine that. You're making $150,000, and half of those folks thought, I can't afford to buy a house here. CEO explains precisely why companies are moving to smaller cities. Here's a quote. "I think cities with super high housing costs are going to see companies looking around at secondary and tertiary cities until something happens with those costs." That was CoStar Group CEO Andrew Florence. "The NSA, government town, risked talent exodus amid morale slump. A former top NSA official said he had been told by 3 current officials that budget problems meant there was too little money for promotions. That is especially important for younger employees who sometimes need 2 jobs to make ends meet in the expensive Washington, D.C. area. And finally, Washington is attracting job seekers at a slower pace than almost anywhere else, from the Washington Post in September of last year. There are fewer job seekers coming to D.C. because the cost of living is prohibitively high for most people, including recent graduates, an economist with the SAGE Policy Group said. So we're starting to see, it's kind of this, it's a tale almost of kind of 2 storylines. In some ways, we have a robust economy, and there's a lot of good news that we've heard about, a lot that's going on. At the same time, when you peel back the layers, you'll start to see there are signs that our region is going to have some challenges when we look at it. Now, if you add on to that, we've got a projection that was done by Jeanette Chapman, who is here from the George Mason University, did research for us that showed that 150,000 more low-income households are projected to come to the region by 2023. So we've got a population bigger than the city of Alexandria who are paying more than half of their income for their housing, and we've got another 150,000 low-income households that are expected to come. So we say it's a people issue, and I should have inserted first. It's a people issue first, not a policy issue. First, you got to think of the people side. We should want a competitive workforce now and in the future, preserve the employment opportunities for local individuals and families, retaining college grads, attracting and keeping the quality workforce who can live here, raise families. I love the article a couple of years ago that was done in the Post. I see Bob McCartney here that was done in the Post. It talked about the young millennial family, and there's this great picture where the family now, right, they are with child, and you see they had gotten into one of those really small units that was all the rage, right? Oh, the kids like the little small mini units. Oh, it's great. Well, all of a sudden now they're having a family, and they showed she's pregnant. And so she literally, their place is so small, they show her literally trying to maneuver in their small place. And the 2 of them are like, you know, what seemed so nice then, all of a sudden is we need a new space. And where are they going to afford to go? So we at the Housing Leaders Group are now trying to think about action-oriented solutions that will provide meaningful impact at a level of scale of demand. We need more partners, more employers to tell their stories and to help shape our solutions through a lens of economic sustainability, and quality of life. So what have we done so far? I want to mention a few things very quickly and then go into what we're doing now. One is, so the Housing Leaders Group has come together as a group of about 15 different organizations, research groups, business organizations, including the 2030 Group, Bernstein Management, the Council of Governments, grant makers, and others, who have produced some research and action-oriented documents. Called The Question is a report that was done by the late Rick Cohen that includes projections of need that were done by Jeanette Chapman. But it was interesting that the title is called The Question because he really said that there are a lot of these ideas and reports that have been done. The challenge, it's as my old high school football coach once said, he said, I can teach you technique, but I can't teach you heart. We are a smart region. The challenge is not that we don't know the technical answers. The challenge is, do we have the heart, the will, call the question, the political will to do what is necessary to address this. We also had a report that was done, sponsored by Citibank and the Grant Makers Association for the Leaders Group, a guidebook for increasing housing affordability in the greater Washington region. Very concrete, straightforward policy and planning tools, recommendations, actions that local governments can take, also in collaboration with private entities. We have participated, the Housing Association of Nonprofit Developers, regional organization, trade organization in the field. We've helped them with some of their plenary sessions. It was interesting 3 years ago to see several elected officials on stage with regional employers, as well as with affordable housing kind of usual suspects, each and every one of them saying, we have to address this issue. And you heard again Bob speak to that. We have to address the issue. The Leadership Greater Washington Thought Series on housing. We think it's great that a regional body would start to adopt and say, for one of the key issues we want to help people dig into is really helping understand, what is this issue? Why is it important? Who does it affect? What can we do about it? So appreciate Bob being here. Bob, I carry one of the papers from the 2030 Group, one of the props that we carry, the roadmap, right? Where are we now? This was an update. I love the fact, and I say Bob Buchanan and the folks who are in the 2030 Group, they're not the usual suspects who show up at City Hall in a yellow T-shirt when we go to advocate for more money for affordable housing. That's not a criticism. That's just, it is what it is, right? We all had different hats. That's not Bob's crew. But Bob's crew in their paper, Bob's crew, by the way, I referred to the Bob's crew. There's a status update, action items. You heard Bob talk about talent. You heard him talk about innovation. You heard him talk about transportation. The fact that a regional collaboration of business organizations has housing and housing affordability as one of their planks is a huge, huge step forward when the power brokers, decision makers, and folks who have access and control over resources are talking about housing affordability. That is a major accomplishment, and the fact that Bob and his folks have been represented at the table. And we've had regional forums where we've presented some of the data and the research that have been done by Jeanette and Rick and others, where local governments, county councils have invited us in to talk about some of the findings that have been held. So let's talk real quick about some of our current efforts. So the group decided, listen, we need to, research and reports are nice. Yes, great. It is necessary, it's important, it's a contribution. But let's go further, and we acknowledge this is a huge issue, could cost tens of billions of dollars if we really wanted to solve for the problem. I love the LifeLock commercials where, the bank's getting robbed and the guy's like, well, we'll do something. He's like, no, I'm a security monitor, right? I don't actually solve for the security threats. I just want to monitor them. So we are a town that's really good at monitoring, right? Analyzing. Right? Evaluating, right? And so the question becomes, though, can we do? Can we execute, right? The former heavyweight champ, Mike Tyson, said you can have the best game plan in the world. Once you get hit in the face, that's when you find out what's going to go on. So we as a region, as it relates to housing affordability, and for our metro, it's like we've now been hit in our face. So the question is, what will we do? So we decided to bring together a group of 60-plus folks from across the region and across sectors. This included the first convening at the Council of Government. It's included a number of elected officials, county executives, and board supervisors, people representing a range of different regional employers, MedStar, Kaiser. We had folks from restaurants and universities who were in the room, in addition to folks from the philanthropic community, in addition to folks from the development community who were in the room, advocates, researchers in the room, really looking at what is it that we need to do to solve for, and our initial focus is on rental housing serving households making below 80% of the area median income. It's about $80,000 to $85,000. That is not the only issue that needs to be addressed. You need to think along the continuum, and some of the research we've done has looked at housing along the continuum, but that's where we're putting a stake in the ground. So there's some big ideas that have come out of the convenings of that group. One is the need to set clear principles and targets on what it is that we want to solve for. The second one is implementing or improving best and promising practices on land use, zoning, and other local government actions where there's also a connect with the private sector. Capital solutions that will add resources to the mix. We've had in one of our pieces, graphs that are shown of capital stacks and all of that kind of stuff. It is getting real now, where we're digging into what are some recommendations that can be made as it relates to money. Communication strategies that will help build political will. A paper that was shown, you don't have to live here, why housing messages are backfiring, and 10 things we can do about it. Article that just was done about a meeting in Fairfax County where Supervisor Kathy Hudgens, right, want to increase density. She really got attacked hard. So this notion of how do we message and create political will so that we can move forward with this. And then a regional backbone infrastructure, the question that was asked in the last presentation. We've got all these groups. So one of the questions is, if we're going to have a multi-year implementation action plan, what is the best platform to ensure that it happens effectively, and is monitored as we go forward? And so we've looked at a number of examples as it relates to that. So I'll end with this. Our goal is to really create an action plan that is adopted and implemented by the participants, and make sure we have a platform for the ongoing implementation. So I'll leave you with this, then we'll go to Q&A, the tagline, some key things to keep in mind. We have to move beyond having million-dollar conversations about billion-dollar problems. We cannot keep playing small ball. If we do, we lose. We can't have million-dollar conversations about billion-dollar problems and think we will solve it. I'll give you a real-time example. The District of Columbia, which puts $100 million into its Housing Production Trust Fund, right, just had a press release from the Department of Housing. It's the largest in the region and one of the largest per capita in the nation. $75 million of that trust fund will go to support 500 units. 500 units that just got announced. Now, that's progress, and that is great, right? But there are 41,000 severely cost-burdened households in Washington, 19,000 more by 2023, and our latest announcement, biggest in the region, 500 units. We need to have fewer meetings, more impact. We have to max out our lane. Anyone who's here needs to think about, how do you max out in your lane? Think about housing as infrastructure. Think about housing as fundamental to our economic sustainability and competitiveness. And what's not on here is to ask the question, what can you do? Take it up, talk it up, get informed, and think of how your organization and your network can do something specific as it relates to this. So I'll end there. Thank you, and we'll take questions. Yes, question in the back. Thank you.
First, David, thank you so much for making that presentation. And I need to piggyback on what David is saying, and I want to say the number again, because the last estimate is the gap is $30 billion in this region to address affordable housing affordability. We've decided we need to change the language because folks have this tendency to hear affordable housing and think of poverty. This is not about poverty. This is about your employees rather. Many of you who work at companies who can't fill positions that are not entry level only, but even mid-level, because we're losing our talent. So I did want to mention that $30 billion, but I also had a question, David. You mentioned that there's 150,000 people expected low-income people expected to come into the region. where and why would that happen if there's not affordability?
Oh, Dr. Jeanette Chapman, all right, here. That was promotions. I'm going to actually ask Jeanette because she actually did the research and she doesn't mind responding. Oh, here, there's our stream with the mic.
That forecast is based on the type of jobs that we are projected to gain over the course of that data is from roughly 2013 to 2023. So over the course of that decade, based on the types of jobs and the implied wage structure of those jobs, we backed into the types of households, so construction jobs, retail jobs, health and education jobs were all forecasted to have really strong growth over that decade, and they still are. And all of those jobs have lower implied wages, which therefore translates into that 150,000 households.
But to this issue, when we are seeing these lower income folks leaving the region because they can't afford to live here to fill those jobs, then that projection is probably a little flawed. But to the point, there will be those jobs that can't be filled. And so I think that's the point we have to solve for in this room, because we're not going to be regionally competitive if we can't solve for this problem.
Well, and I think part of it, too, is you think about part of what's in that, too, is mobility, right? So if you read the Amazon, right, the document they sent out, and they trumpet a bunch of folks with $100,000 jobs, right? And we heard the data about people who are making $150,000 think I can't afford to live here. But if I make $100,000, there's more likelihood, because of my expertise, my marketability, and my income, I may have more mobility to get to a less expensive region, right? If I'm making $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 because I'm working at Marriott, I'm working at the industries that are vibrant here as well, I may not have that mobility to pick up and relocate to Phoenix. So I'm stuck here, but what I end up doing is moving further out in the region. So I move to the affordability in the region as opposed to, well, I'm going to pick up and relocate to Phoenix or Minneapolis. So I think that's part of what you see baked into that, is that people may, you're right, on the face of it, you say, well, this doesn't make sense, but if you kind of peel it back, some of those jobs at the income levels that a lot of folks would love to see will have mobility, and so they'll make the decision because they can. If I'm making $25,000, $35,000, my move is I'm going further out in the region, but I can't pick up and move. Other questions? Got a couple over here.
Thanks, David. I'm Piper Davis from class of 2017 nonstop. My question is really about what you said about moving to action, and you used the example of the recent announcement from DC about 500 units. What are some of the blue sky ideas that you all have about this that, may not be out there yet, but if company A and government B and city Y came together, what are a couple of possible solutions to this $30 billion problem?
So first of all, I'm smiling when you ask that question because literally I carry in my wallet a Peanuts comic strip where Snoopy talks about coloring the sky blue, and anyone who knows me knows that I love talking about coloring the sky blue. So thank you for that. So it's a gamut of things. So for example, what if we were able to get we're literally having a drill down meeting next week with some folks to look at how do we get to a scale of multi-billion-dollar funds, equity funds that leverage private debt. So if we could get investors who would be willing to take a lower return than market rate return, understanding if we could get, for example, there are conversations some of our colleagues are having in the West Coast with someone who's in the health services field, the medical field, about potentially investing $50 to $100 million as one employer, one regional employer, into a fund. What if we could find 10 companies, 30 companies, who are each willing to invest $5, $10, $15 million at reduced return rates, knowing that it's for the region's good, that could then leverage private capital. We have plenty of banks who, for multiple reasons, do lending in this region. But what a lot of the developers will say is in order particularly to serve households at lower income levels, you need to get that second layer of what they call mezzanine debt, or some people call it dequity. So one piece could be if we had multiple employers who were willing to invest in a large fund like that. and take lower returns. That's number one. Number two, every local jurisdiction ought to have some sort of locally funded housing production trust fund, call it what you will. Some have it, DC, Montgomery County, Arlington, other jurisdictions don't. And so they need to think of it as making an investment, right, in their own jurisdiction, but something regionally. And part of the conversations we're having is, what's interesting is, you talk to elected officials, in my 13 years at Enterprise, where I work now, you talk to any local official and they'll all say this: we're doing more than our fair share. And I said, well, by definition, everybody can't be doing more than their fair share. But if you talk to any of them, that is what they would say. We're doing more than our fair share. Get them to do something. Well, we know that's not the case. So part of this conversation is, let's get them all to have, for example, a trust fund. Let's get them all to have some version of inclusionary zoning, so that as new units get built, market rate units, and there are people who can figure out the math, of how do you make that work so affordable units get built in. And let me also say this, part of it is, and our board chairman, Ron Terwilliger, who used to be very big and successful in the real estate game, said to some folks out in Fairfax County several years ago, when conversations were going on about inclusionary zoning in around Tyson's Corner, Ron said to his peers, and I say his peers because Ron is a very wealthy white Republican. Okay? So I'm not their peer. He is. And he said to them, and this is my language, not his, but essentially what he said is, when you think about the returns you need to get, you don't have to get a Bentley return. Be okay with a really nice Mercedes. That's my language, not his, but that's essentially what he was saying. People will say, well, we can't make it work. Oh, you're going to drive us out. So first thing, me as an advocate will say, where are you going to go, Topeka? So that's one. We have to have that political will to, my friend Bob, the Bobs of the world, the developers of the world say, too much, right? So first off, okay, you can leave, because there's going to be another guy who's willing to make that money. But secondly, let's work with them and say, what if we reorient our expectations of what a return needs to be? And so if we all know that this is something that is for the region's good, and that if we all have to make Bentley returns, we're going to have troubles. But if we all do real nice in a real Benz, the region prospers. So those are just a couple of examples, and that's what we're hoping to come out with as part of this regional collective effort, with this list of things that folks will get into blue sky that are at whole different levels of scale and that reorient fundamentally the conversations that governments, that employers, and philanthropy. One last quick example. There are folks in philanthropy who before often are sitting on lots of money. They do great work in terms of grants and all of that. But how do you leverage that capital for lending? What if every foundation in this region said, we're going to do some sort of program-related investment, right? So it's not a grant. It's money that comes back, right? But it will be leveraged for lending and not just a $50,000 grant. That's another example. I will, and I'm gonna see, there was a question right over here. I'll close on the note. There was a question right back there.
Good morning. You were great. Thank you.
Thank you.
So my question is, you said several times in your presentation, you said, do we have the will to what needs to be done? And you talked about messaging and the political will. So, and you said that part of your plan is to have some communications around that. So I'd love for you to expand about some of the communications about those particular issues.
Watch this political response. Yes. So we actually have, the short answer is, I don't know all of the nuances of how we're going to do it. There is literally a group of folks who are expert in that field. I think I saw Claire Flannery here and others who are kind of experts in communications who are going to be getting in a room to start to think about helping us think through what are the right communication strategies broadly that work. I will say one of the presentations we had was a report that talked about from Dr. Tiffany Manuel, a colleague of ours in the work at Frameworks, that a lot of times the messaging we do is actually counterproductive, not just for housing, but for any kind of cause marketing. So bottom line is we're going to get experts in the room to kind of think about what is the right way to message. One of the things, though, I will say that we have talked about and are looking at is how do we get organizing broadly defined from what I call the boardroom to the street corner, right? So there are organizers who we typically think of organizers who will go out, right, rally folks at a church or a synagogue or a mosque, or who will go and rally and organize tenants. Great. But how do we organize the Bobs of the world, the leadership Greater Washingtons of the world, go into corporate boardrooms and do communications? Think of communications as how do we communicate a message to an employer? This is why this is important for you. Here's a menu of 10 things that you could do to help in this issue. So part of the communication strategy that we're looking at is to think about how do we organize in that way so that audiences across the region who are sitting in very different chairs are all thinking about what I can do. What I like to say is you don't build a brick, right? Build a wall all at once. It's one brick at a time. My brick may not be Doug's brick, may not be Rosie Allen Herring's brick, may not be Bob Buchanan's brick. But if we all know we're putting what we can on the wall, then we don't feel like I'm out here alone. We hope that'll encourage more people to get involved, and people will think broadly. So we're going to work to create and craft very specific things that people could do. One example of that is the impact note Terry asked me to mention. It's an effort, essentially acts like a CD without government protection, but the Washington Regional Association of Grant Makers collaborated with, full disclosure, my company Enterprise to do something called Our Region, Your Investment. And it allows individuals and organizations to invest capital. They get a return, but it gets used to support affordable housing. We've got investors that range from individuals, churches, American Express, developers, foundations have all invested nationally and others locally. And so it kind of democratizes investment that you know can be used for affordable housing. So that's one example. Yes, ma'am.
The other thing I wanted to add is when you talked about philanthropy, you might want to talk to the Meyer Foundation. They're doing some extraordinary new work around racial equity, and they've redirected some of their funding to look at the programs you're actually talking about. And by the way, I'm C. Marie Taylor from Leadership Montgomery.
Right. Thank you for that. And I'm smiling because Meyer has actually we have talked with them. Nikki Gorin, the CEO there, is a part of this regional convening, and they actually are an investor as well in the impact note. Yes, sir. Last question. Yes, sir.
Good morning.
Okay.
David Gorodetsky, class of 2015. Enough said. Thank you, David.
Enough said. All right.
Enough said. Thank you. You guys do an amazing work. The question that I have is, so you're going to fill the gap, but then how do you change the trend? Because it's a market-driven issue. And hypothetically, blue sky, you got the $30 billion, what's next? And some ideas about how you change a trend that is market-driven.
I'm not going to pretend I have an easy answer to that one. I'm not. I think a couple of things, though, come to mind. One is there's a whole conversation on supply and demand, and as the district a few years ago, one of their housing plans they were looking at not just supply issues, but also demand issues. So, i.e., can we help people make more money, right? And that gets into conversations, the connectedness between things like education and services and the like, so that people are more marketable in their skills and can make more money and afford more in the marketplace. But that issue of, if people are willing to pay $100, right? They're going to someone's going to build something that they can get $100 for. So I think that is part of a larger conversation we do have to have. And I think markets like this one, like a San Francisco, you're seeing now some policy moves that are going on that are trying to, some might argue, artificially restrain price escalations. And so to me, that's one of those like econ class conversations of what do we do when, if the market is left unchecked, right, and that kind of overarching hand is not enough, and then all of a sudden you get what we have, right, which is the cliche, but it's like the tale of two cities. And so we have to, I think, one of the things I think we don't do enough of around a lot of issues is have open and honest conversation, because for some people that is okay. And if that's okay with you, as my high school football coach now quoted twice in this, you say, if you're scared, say you're scared. So if we're okay with let the market go, let the market be, and whoever can make it, right, survival of the fittest, and it may mean we have a tale of two cities. If people are okay with that, I think people need to say that honestly, and we talk about what the implications of that are. If we're not okay with that, for whatever reasons, then let's not just say, well, we can't do anything about it. Actually we can. But we have to then work together to figure out what those solutions would be.
Sandy Hallmark of the 2013. Is one of the approaches to regional employers, particularly the larger ones, not to reach out to them on a sort of foundation and philanthropy basis, but on a this is what your business needs to survive basis, and you should invest in this in order to get the employees you otherwise can't get? I mean, you can always approach donors from the heartstrings community service side, but the pocketbook is a really successful way, and this seems to me matters to major regional employers.
Short answer is yes, and that is part of the approach that's being taken here and actually in some other regions. And actually in one of the Leadership Greater Washington sessions, one of the most powerful takeaways that I and some colleagues had was when several employers talked about what it costs every time they lose an employee, right? And so there's a cost there. And so you say, okay, it's one of those, well, if we invested this much, we might be able to keep that person in our region. So yes, absolutely. And again, presenting investment options that aren't grants, but where they know their capital will come back, those are absolutely conversations that are going on where we're trying to create pools of capital where employers can invest, know they'll get a return, and know that it's an investment in something that benefits them, their employees, and the like. So you're exactly right. So I think I turn over to Doug Duncan now. Thank you all so much for your time.
Thank you very
Appreciate
much.
it.
Let's thank all of our speakers so far this morning. Thank you all so much for being here and helping. We're going to take a break. We need you back here at 10 o'clock. We're then going to hear about Metro. We're going to hear about the Greater Washington Partnership and then do some back and forth with each other. So thank you all very much. See you at 10 o'clock. So we could have spent this whole session on Metro. We decided not to because we didn't want to depress everybody. Clearly, that's a major challenge facing the region, and it's something that we need to fix to show the country we can get things done here in Washington, outside of Capitol Hill. So we have Emeka Monime, the Deputy Executive Director of the Federal City Council, who the Federal City Council is really taking the lead to sort of bring people together to come up with a reform effort for Metro that isn't just give us more money. I think that's the challenge that people have, that elected officials have, is Metro needs more money, but I'm not taking your thunder, am I? Okay. There's a worry that you're just throwing good money after bad, that unless they make other changes, the money's not really going to solve the problem. So let me turn it over to Emeka, and please go ahead.
Great. Doug, thank you, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm Emeka Monime at the Federal City Council and LGW class of 2012. We are busting loose. I think this is maybe the second time I've been before this group to talk about Metro, and one of the running jokes is that when I run into colleagues like Bob Buchanan and David and others, people just tell me, go fix Metro. Rest assured, Emeka Monime is not fixing Metro on his own. But what you can rest assured is you have the business community and the philanthropic community all leaning in and working together to think about this really critical piece of infrastructure and how it knits our community together and solving it. And we've spent probably the better part of 2 years since Paul Wiedefeld came on board at Metro, working with him, thinking through what the real core challenges are, to the point that brought up by Joe from Gallup, what the premise of the problem is, and making sure we were focused on the right solutions, not solutions that we've done before, things we've tried before that weren't successful, but really framing the problem correctly and attacking it in that way. Metro is the quintessential regional problem. It is probably the most important piece of infrastructure that we've created and developed in this region. I'm gonna say some things. I'm gonna actually leave you with 4 numbers before I jump into it. 1 million, 54%, 3.1 billion, and 25%. Let's see if I got those right. Metro is the key to our advantage. Our region developed around the metro stations. Since it was built back in the 80s, we built communities. Our work and travel patterns are built and kind of pivoted off of that investment. It's regarded by most of the nation as America's subway. It's really one of our most iconic and important pieces of infrastructure. So a million. First of all, Metro provides 1 million trips a day. That's important if you ride transit. You know that you have the capacity to get where you need to on transit. But if you don't ride transit, that means 1 million trips a day are not on the roads. They're not clogging up 66. They're not sitting on the Beltway with you. It provides a benefit to you even if you never intersect with Metro on a daily basis. 54% of all jobs are within a half mile of the metro system. It is the base of our economics in this region. People that work in our region are using metro, the majority of them. 3.1 billion, that same half mile radius, 3.1 billion in real estate taxes are generated in this region within that same half mile radius. Again, it is an economic driver for the entire region. And the last number, 25. Without metro, 25% longer commutes on a daily basis. So in a previous life, a quick anecdote, I used to be the director of the DOT here in the city for Mayor Fenty. And I remember sitting down with the GM at Metro pretty much every month when I went to the board meetings and telling them, I would be fired if it were not for you. If Metro didn't work on a daily basis, there's no way we could manage the congestion in the city. We couldn't move people like they needed to. The city could not be open for business. Metro is essential in making sure that our region and our city works. And then lastly, and this is kind of a little bit of at least I see it, this is probably the best example of interjurisdictional cooperation that we have as a region. We have other organizations like DC Water, another fine organization, but in terms of impact to the region, Metro is our best example where we've actually reached across the river, across state lines, and worked together to come up with something that we both operate, we pay for, and we build our regional economy around. It's important. So that's all the good stuff. Let's talk about the not so good stuff. So here's a long list of numbers I can let you peruse over, and I'm not gonna read all those numbers to you. And I will note that these are numbers from last year. When the system was really in crisis, ridership was going down. There was a structural budget, about $290 million per year in the Metro budget. There's challenges in terms of its pension liabilities. Also, the state of good repair, we know that there's just capital needs and investments need to be made in the system. I'll stop kind of talking through the list of problems. I think the one thing that we're really grateful for and we should be thankful for as a region, we do have an excellent leader in Paul Wiedefeld, and Paul's making some very difficult decisions and thinking as strategically as he can about where we need to go and doing things in the short term to get us there. But as you look at this list of challenges, the safety issues, the reliability issues, the financial issues, this is a system in crisis. There's really no other way that you can look at it. There's no way that the system in our region can persist if this continues and we just kind of find one-time solutions to kick the can down the road and say, we'll figure it out next time. Or we got past this budget season, we'll figure it out the next time. We believe the time to act is now. And so what we've spent time on our own at the Federal City Council initially, and then we began linking arms with some of the other business organizations in the region, was to think about, well, what does that reform agenda look like? I'll clarify that there wasn't a tremendous amount of original thinking required. One of the things that folks need to remember is many of these ideas are not new. We know the problem. We've defined the problem. We've even laid out some of the solutions. Sometimes we've attempted to address and solve it, but we've taken half measures. We haven't gone far enough. We've done enough to be able to kick the can and kind of get some breathing room, whether it's for an election cycle or just we didn't have the political will to get it done. We need Metro to be safe, affordable, and reliable. That is the bare minimum we need as a region for it to be. To achieve that, we identify that the challenges are rooted in governance, in operations, and in funding. Together, I think it's more important to realize that you can't do one of these and solve the issue. You have an unbalanced stool where you have to come back and eventually deal with the governance issue. You have to deal with the operational challenges. You have to deal with the lack of funding, which frankly we've done for the last 2 decades. We've raised money before, billions of dollars for Metro, and then we've spent the money, and then we come back again 7 years later saying, I need more money because I didn't address the other two issues. It is a comprehensive reform that looks at governance changes that make sure that the board of directors focuses on the best interests of the system for the benefit of the ridership and the jurisdictions. There's a lot of other sub-issues underneath that, but that's the core issue at the governance level, is making sure that board has the skill set and the focus on the things that the system needs. 2, around operations, a safe, efficient system where we're investing properly. I think this is an area we can feel very comfortable that the current GM is very focused on this, and he's actually set forth a number of proposals that will get us in this direction. I think we just need to support him in that. And lastly, the one that takes up probably most of the air on this discussion is the funding, because it is not just a money problem, but it certainly is a money problem. We need to make sure that we provide long-term financial support for the system. And I'll repeat again, the time to act is now. And I say that, and it could be overemphasizing, but we believe that there's this curve on the system. The system was built back in the early 70s. It has a useful life as a physical asset. And I think what we're seeing now is the thing that we built, we invested in, has run its course. And you have to recapitalize it like any business or any car or any home. We're in a period where we do have to do these things and put the proper amount of money into the system to make it work for us. And so this is a very important time for us to act on this issue. So we certainly know we can't do this alone, not the Federal City Council, certainly not just the 2030 Group, Greater Washington Partnership, Board of Trade, and others. We need to have a coalition of folks that understand and believe in these principles, and we've been working to do that. This summer, we drafted a letter that laid out many of the points that I've spoken to. We sent it to the two governors, the mayor, and the U.S. Secretary of Transportation. And this, hopefully I didn't miss anybody that signed on the letter, but these are the logos of all those organizations, 33 in total, hopefully to be 34 very soon. We're looking to broaden that coalition. So one of the things I want to leave with you, if your organization wants to understands the issue and kind of endorses this approach, we'd love to have your support as we build this coalition to provide surround sound on this topic, whether it's on Capitol Hill here in DC, in the district council offices, or in Annapolis or in Richmond in the coming legislative sessions. So I'll come back to that momentarily, but we have been looking to broaden this beyond just the DC business community focusing on this issue. This is a regional problem. We care about it, and we also believe that our ridership and the groups that they work with believe in that issue as well. So what does the path forward look like? So hopefully I have not discouraged you too much, because I'm actually quite optimistic that there is at least there's a window of opportunity that's opening up before us. And so I do think that, again, the more voices we have kind of reinforcing that there is a path forward, we should stay the course. There needs to be political courage to move forward into that space. I think we have a good chance. So, principles. As I said, Paul Wiedefeld has come up with some really good, solid recommendations around operations that we should be supportive of, ensure that he has that support. We should agree to the governance proposals that have been proposed, and I'll speak a little bit more about that, what's coming up in the fall. And then funding. We've identified principles about adequate funding. It needs to be enough to make the improvements we need. We've heard about $500 million a year that's available to be bonded for the system. It needs to be reliable. Ideally, we've talked about a sales tax or some source that is then reliable that you can leverage and make sure it's available every year, so you can then do number 3, bond against that to make the improvements required. So the next step is that we are entering a season of, we think are triggering activities. So certainly the elections are right around the corner in Virginia, and so there's going to be changing in leadership in Virginia and an opportunity to put to bed something that a new governor could have to live with for a long period of time. That creates an opportunity for a solution to be identified. We also have the LaHood report. Secretary LaHood was retained by Governor McAuliffe several months ago to study this problem in detail and provide recommendations. We believe, given the conversations he's had across the region, that there is some level of agreement as to some of the principles in that proposal. That, again, will put this issue front and center before the region. And there's also discussion of a congressional bill. One of the proposals the Federal City Council came out in support of, given where we were at the beginning of the summer, is that this needed to be looked at much like the DC Control Board back in the 90s, where the city just couldn't get its act together, and there was a need and responsibility for the federal government to interject itself to kind of right-size the ship. And I think as you look out onto 7th and 8th Street, the city's responded quite well to that help and support. It was our view that that could be the same model that could work for WMATA. Alternatively, cities like Boston have looked at reform boards with much stronger, empowered boards to bring those changes to provide a long-term trajectory for success. We think that there could be a bill that comes in, that speaks to that, and Representative Comstock for Virginia has been the chief proponent of that, but we've also heard there's other members of Congress, including Jim Delaney from Maryland, that have believed that that type of a bill could make sense to move things forward. And then most importantly, we have the winter legislative sessions in Annapolis and Richmond. And what we're hearing is that 3 triggering factors there. And I apologize for it being so far down the page. Paul Wiedefeld will be introducing his budget, I think as soon as next week. And that begins the real conversation of what type of a system does this region want to fund as it relates to WMATA. It's either you find more money in your pocket and we can have the system that we've grown accustomed to and we want, or if you cannot provide the money, this is the more truncated system that we're going to have to live with. It will mean reduced service. It will mean delays on rail lines. It may be the deferment of some capital programs. I think that as an issue, putting that on the table so it's not conjecture, will help kind of advance this conversation. We're also hearing that Governor McAuliffe, before he does move on, is going to force this issue and present some proposal to the Virginia legislature about how to properly fund, including addressing the governance problem. And then lastly, we're also hearing word that the Maryland Assembly is prepared to take up this conversation as well. So again, as I said, I think there is actually a window of opportunity where a number of triggering actions, both at the state level, but from other actors, are going to force us to have this conversation and ideally have it to a conclusion, because we will need to fund the program, fund WMATA, no later than June of next year. And these windows in the winter will help set us up for that. So I tend to be an optimistic person in general, but this gives me even greater optimism about the fact that we'll do something. I don't know if it'll be exactly what I've laid out for you, but there is something that's going to happen. I think that one of the things that's important for us to do is to collectively find our voice, surround sound the issue so the leaders that are making these decisions hear the same things. You have to do this. You have to do it in this way. And what we've learned, and what we're learning as we're talking to voters in the region, this is a very sophisticated electorate. They get these problems. It's not as simple as writing a check. And I'll say that because I know elected leaders like to just say, I funded a program, and that's the end of it. The harder thing to do is, I'm funding a program, I'm going to provide oversight, and you're going to do it the way it's intended to deliver the outcome required. And that's what we need them to do. So that's the end of my presentation. I am happy to talk a little bit more in detail about specific elements of the challenge, what the path forward looks like, or I'm happy to sit down. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Monica Johnson. I'm the class of 2018. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit more about the proposed changes in governance vis-a-vis Metro.
Yes. So I'll start with talking about some of the other models we've looked at. So the city of the MBTA, Metropolitan Boston Transportation Authority, had a transit system that was in disarray as well. Several years ago, the governor took responsibility for that and put in place a 5-member reform board that would basically for 3 to 5 years work out all the troubling issues within the system, operationally, financially, and set it on a solid path so that the governor could come back in and kind of reconstitute the board. We think something similar to that makes sense here, where the 4 signatories, District, Maryland, Virginia, and the federal government would appoint a member, one member that sits on that board with the right set of qualifications, skills, and experience to run a very complex, capital-intensive business. I mean, that's what we're talking about. This is a multi-billion-dollar business, and having those skill sets at the board of directors gives Paul Wiedefeld the right advisors, the right access to information to be able to properly advance the organization. So it would be those leaders identifying members to sit on that board of directors.
Hi, my name is Tony Cancelosi, Columbia Lighthouse for the Blind. I looked at all the names that you had signed up, but I didn't see any organization that related to people with disabilities. And we have an aging population that's 158 million baby boomers. And what is the thought about how we're going to make special accommodations for the future with Metro for people with disabilities and the aging population?
So first I'll say we'd love to have your support and happy to talk to you about the broader coalition. So as you know, Metro has the Metro Access Program, which is the way that it provides service and transportation services to that community. That's where, I mean, as it relates to Metro and its challenges, that's the first place that conversation starts. There's also a Riders Advisory Council where that discussions happens with the board of directors. So there is an avenue for the disabled community to bring those issues before the board. As an organization, we haven't specifically called out any specific subset of constituency at this point, but I'm happy to have that conversation with you.
Hi, I'm Robert McCartney from the Washington Post, LGW 2007-007, licensed to lead.
Impressive.
Tony Cancelosi, by the way, my classmate, who didn't mention that he was in our class, Tony. So I have a couple of questions. First of all, do you, based on your conversations with the leaders of the 3 jurisdictions, actually the 4, including the federal government, do you think there will be support from the 4 jurisdictions for the LaHood proposal? I mean, and what you're also endorsing, the 5-member board. Do you think that that's going to achieve, that's going to achieve success basically in coming months? Do you think there's enough political support for that?
So, I can't speak to the political support, but I do know that on a off-the-record basis, we have heard that there is openness to moving in that direction. I think that people want to understand the legalities of it, the mechanisms, whatnot, but I think that given some of the episodes that have really played out over even the last couple of weeks as it relates to the board dynamics, it's only further enforcing the fact that something does need to be done in terms of how the board works. I'll take this opportunity, I'll make a commercial. I think one of the things I've heard across all the conversations, this isn't just an issue about money or governance, it's really about regional cooperation. And I think that's the core issue that we're dealing with here. And so how you appoint the board is secondary once you decide that I want to work together as a region to solve something, and then it naturally kind of flows out of that. So long way of saying that we do believe that there's tremendous support for this direction, subject to the details.
And then my second question, on the funding issue, a lot of people, including the COG technical group, said that the 1% regional sales tax would be the most effective way to raise the money. But as you know, there's a lot of political opposition to that, particularly in Northern Virginia. So it seems as though the debate has been moving towards letting each jurisdiction decide for itself how to raise the money, as long as it's reliable, bondable. Is that, do you think that that's where we're going to end up? And do you have any sense of what that funding solution would look like in each of the jurisdictions?
So, no, I'd love to, as I tell you, if I knew what it was. But I do think that we're going to get to those principles, funding that provides what's required, it's bondable, it's predictable. And I think given the conversations, I think the business community has a strong position about the fact that it needs to be there. I think this is where you're looking at your elected officials to frankly do their jobs and solve that problem. It's saying this is the goal, this is where we want to get to, your job is to get us there in the way that makes sense for your jurisdiction.
Hi, Rebecca Cooper from class of 2015, enough said. I'm the founder of a company, Capital Insights, where we focus on smart things happening in Washington and other capital cities. So I look forward to highlighting Metro when all the problems get solved. But I just want to draw to your attention 2 things that really concern me as someone who loves Metro, completely relied on Metro in my 20s when I came to the Capitol, and know how important it is for our business community to thrive. So one is, while I was working with Iran at American University, I was devastated to see how little millennials trust Metro now, to the point that when I had students from American University meet me at CNN, which is just behind Union Station, and I stressed to them the importance of being on time, they all took Uber. Yeah. These are middle-class kids who have jobs to support themselves. It has a reputation as a high tuition school with rich kids, but these are middle-class kids who support themselves, and they would rather pay for Uber. And I said, guys, traffic, you're always better off on the red line. And they said, we just didn't trust Metro for such an important meeting. And that broke my heart, because it's costing them money, and that's a real trust issue that you're going to have to overcome for us to keep these millennials. And millennials is something we study at AU, and we all know we're starting to lose them again. So that's one issue. I'm a journalist because it's easier to throw out these questions and problems than to solve them. So I don't know how you solve that, branding, but trust. But then the second one, following on what Tony said, one of the most heartbreaking stories I did as a journalist, and I did a lot of really sad ones, but I was trying to highlight the constant elevator problems at Metro. And I met up with a young woman who is wheelchair bound and worked in Roslyn and was going to her first ever black tie event. And she needed shoes from Pentagon City. And she had to take the whole day off because to get from Roslyn to Pentagon City with the constant elevator outages, she had to go this incredible circuitous route that meant she couldn't go during her lunch hour. And she was a very mobile young woman who, had the elevators been working, she would have zipped on over and gotten her shoes for this event and come back. And, you know, I've covered many of the story, people dying. Obviously, she's going to a gala, she's not dying, but it broke my heart to see that someone who was working so hard with her disabilities was being let down by Metro. So I know all of us crowd to get, not all of us, I've been guilty of crowding to get on those elevators when obviously I don't need to. I think a lot of us do that, but if you can fix that elevator problem, there are people in real need. So thank you and good luck.
Thanks. Well, so let me, I do want to respond to the first point, because I do think that, and I think DWP will speak a little bit to this. One of the great opportunities, I think, as we go forward with Metro is thinking about the fact that you're right, the younger riders, the millennials now, are looking for mobility options, not a Metro option. I think that one of the things that a new board will be required to do is think about, well, where does Metro fit into the landscape of transportation options that riders can choose from? And how do you make it easily to access and pivot from, I've started off my trip on a bike share, but now I want to hop on the Orange Line, and then I'm going to switch to Uber for the last leg of it. I think we're going to see more and more of that, where the trip is chopped up amongst a number of different modes, a lot different than the system we built. The system we built before was a commuter railroad underground. Now it's a part of a broader piece of regional transportation infrastructure. And so one of the things I think that a future board does is think about, okay, so how do we fit into that marketplace? Where's our space? How do we compete and develop partnerships with an Uber and a Lyft so that we can be a part of that trip and get revenue from that entire trip versus being cut out completely? I think that's the kind of strategic thinking a board of directors that brings skill sets in the industry, brings to the board of directors. The previous board, and no disrespect because I was a previous board member, your job was to go to Metro and make sure that you could go back and bring DC money in my case and make sure you could fund it, but make sure you never paid more than you had to. A recipe for like fair share. Never pay more than your fair share, and here we are today. We need a board of directors that says, this is the system we need, this is how it fits in, and these are the resources needed to deliver that. I think that's a mind shift that we as a region need to embrace if we want to be competitive. And I think that one of the things I'll leave you with, unless there's any other questions, I think it plugs in directly into the affordable housing question. Certainly plugs into the economic competitiveness at the global level. People that come to this city, they're going to compare us to the Tube in London. They're going to compare us to other systems in Japan. And having been there, we got some work to do.
Last question, Kathy. Todd.
Sorry, Kathy. Thank you, Kathy. My classmate in class 2017, I'm Todd Turner, nonstop, for all the nonstoppers in the room, which I think there are most of us are here. Obviously, I'm a county council member from Prince George's County. I'm one of the elected officials that are trying to deal with this issue. I chair our transportation committee. And the county council, and have my colleague here, Danielle Glaros, in front of me, have been trying to deal with these issues at a local level. Obviously, we have 15 metro stops that we'd like to fully develop, unlike other parts of the system. My question is more on the governance side. One of the reasons, obviously, and I think we need to change it, but one of the things that we have to keep in there is, too, we have representation as a local government on the board. Northern Virginia communities that are paying into the system have representation on the board. So while there might be a short-term fix, potentially, with the control board, for those jurisdictions that are paying into the system, there has to be representation, I think. And so I'm not sure how we get over that hurdle. Now, in Maryland, we don't allow elected officials on the board. So that might be a vehicle for something to consider, that we're having people with certain criteria and professional background that have to be part of the board as part of that. Doesn't mean it gets you perfectly to where you want as part of that, because obviously we have local representation, the governor has representation, and if we're not seeing eye to eye as local governments with our state government, then that's creates some issues as well, as that might be also the occasion of Virginia. So I just want to put that in mind as these things are being considered. Because let's be honest, we know one thing as well. Nobody wants to give up their power, right? Unless they're told to in some other form. And so maybe that might be a viable option by having the federal government come in, as long as they're willing to provide the operational funds, which is a big part of the conversation as well. They provided capital as part of PREA, but who are we transporting as part of Metro? It's mostly the federal workforce. So I appreciate the efforts, the political efforts, and we'll continue the conversation. But I think that representational issue is going to be something that we're going to have to try to overcome. So.
I agree with that point. I don't know if that's a solution that tomorrow you kind of wave a wand and solve. I'll just leave you with the last anecdote. So I think it was a year ago at the Federal City Council annual board meeting, we had Secretary Fox, USCOT, Secretary of Transportation, come and sit with us, and we had a conversation, a closed-door conversation with him about Metro, which was very, it was instructive. And I think the thing that struck me that he left us with was, as you talk about Metro reform, this region needs to have a conversation with itself about what Metro should be for it and what it's prepared to do to realize that. I think that that's the conversation, maybe after this solution that's before us in this next 6-month window happens. Well, what do we want Metro to be, and what are the things we need to put in place to have that outcome? I think that it's not a one-time discussion and we kind of wipe our hands and we go on. In Boston, their reform board has a 3 to no more than 5-year term. It will go away. During that interim time, there's a number of tasks. It must deliver a long-term financing plan. It must deliver a governance proposal. They've created a structure that stabilizes the organization and then creates a path forward to sustainability. So I think we can have that conversation. I think that we do need to mobilize and do something while there is opportunity, while there are balls being thrown across the plate. Let's hit those that are before us. Not like the Nationals, but let's hit these. And then we move forward. And so with that, I'm going to end.
Emeka, thank you very much. Like I said, we could have spent the whole day on Metro. And we actually asked Paul Wiedefeld to come, but he's at a Metro board meeting today where they're talking about some of these very governance issues. So we'll see what happens at the meeting. You ready, Mimi? Ready. Next, we're going to have a sort of discussion with the Greater Washington Partnership. Russ Ramsey and Jason Miller are here. This is a new regional group that I don't think was around last year, or just started when we had this. So we're thrilled that they're here today. We're honored to have both of them here. Mimi Ye is going to hold a conversation with them, and we'd love to hear. They just published a transportation report that Bob McCartney wrote about today, and I will say I think one of the points in your article, Bob, was the need for business leadership in the region, that we need a group of business leaders to come forward, which you all are doing, and say, here's where we need to go to help steer the region. I think that's something that's been missing for some time from this region, and will be very, very helpful. So, Mimi?
Great. All right. Thanks. Come on up, please. I'm just going to grab a seat here. All right. So we're moving on in the agenda. How's everybody doing? Good conversations, right? The topics, I think, have been so compelling, and I think they're a great lead-in to this part of the session, which is about the vision for the region's future. And I'm joined by Russ Ramsey and Jason Miller from the Greater Washington Partnership, who I'll introduce in just a minute. So quickly, a few words about Greater Washington Partnership. And I'll do the intro, but then you guys will correct everything that I say that's wrong about it. It's a CEO-led civic organization dedicated to making the Greater Washington region, from Baltimore through Richmond, one of the world's best places to live, work, and build a business. And I think that theme really resonates with all of the conversation and topics that we've had across this morning and all of the great speakers that we've had. This is also a shared interest that Accenture has in the same geographic footprint, because Accenture is invested in increased innovation in our area, and that comes from a digital studio that we've recently set up in downtown DC, a cyber lab in our Arlington facilities in Virginia, and a partnership that we have with 1776 on critical topics that are top of mind today, like emerging digital health solutions. So with that, I'm really excited to introduce our two guests to talk about how our shared passions can lead to growth in the greater Washington region. So first, Russ Ramsey. You both have very long bios, by the way, and I'm not going to be able to get through everything, but I'm trying to hit all of the great high points. Russ is a successful entrepreneur, financier, businessman, educational and community leader, and philanthropist. He is currently the CEO of Ramsey Asset Management and chairman of Greater Washington Partnership. In 2014, Russ led the Capital Region's effort to bid for the 2024 Olympic Games. He was previously chairman of the George Washington University Board of Trustees, and perhaps is best known for co-founding Friedman Billings Ramsey Group. Did I get that right? Great, thank you. In 1989, which became a top 10 investment bank. Russ and his wife live in Great Falls, Virginia, where they are active philanthropists who are focused on at-risk families through the W. Russell and Norma G. Ramsey Foundation. Next to Russ is Jason Miller. He is the inaugural CEO of the Greater Washington Partnership, where he works collaboratively with the region's top business, academic, and civic leaders to influence and affect meaningful change on the area's most critical issues. Before joining the partnership, Jason implemented economic policy at the White House as Deputy Assistant to President Obama and as Deputy Director of the National Economic Council. During his 7 years at the White House, Jason implemented and developed some of the administration's most important efforts to spur a more competitive, innovative economy, including launching Manufacturing USA program, spearheading infrastructure investment initiatives, leading the White House's efforts to provide Puerto Rico with tools needed to address its economic and fiscal crisis, and developing and growing Select USA, which was the first federal effort to bring job-creating investment to the U.S. from around the world. Jason was also a management consultant for the Boston Consulting Group, and earlier with Maricon Associates, where he advised leading companies on strategic and operational issues, lives in Maryland with his wife and their 2 children. Okay, so let's start out a little bit with talking about the origins of the partnership. So Doug mentioned that it's a fairly new organization, recently established. Can you tell us, Russ, maybe a little bit more about how it all came together last December, and more importantly, why was it established?
Sure. So Mimi, thank you, and thanks to everyone for having us here today. I really appreciate the leadership of this organization and all the surrounding counties, and Doug, your leadership, and everyone else that's participated to make this really a great organization. And so briefly, I'd like to cover 3 areas, which is sort of, why Greater Washington Partnership, what's the history, and sort of why now. And the origins go back to 2013 when the U.S. Olympic Committee put out a sort of a letter of interest, not quite as popular as Amazon, and invited cities to, if they had an interest in perhaps hosting the 2024 Olympic Games, would they be interested, and what would it look like? And thanks to some people in this room, Bob Sweeney and others, Washington, D.C. was in the area was sort of one of the cities that got a look. When I say we, it was a great group of philanthropists and community leaders and some from the business community, including Ted Leonsis, were asked to sort of think about, would we like to put together a bid for the Washington area for the Olympic Games? And we spent 6 months or so not focusing on, gee, wouldn't it be great to have an Olympic Games, but wouldn't it be great to have something 10 years out that maybe you could look 30 and 40 years out and say, if we had a catalyst of something, the biggest sporting event in the world, biggest event in the world, what could we get done that wouldn't otherwise get done around that catalyst? And so in 2014, we spent most of that year putting together a very comprehensive bid. We went from 24 to 4. We were the bridesmaid, not the bride, and we just assumed, quite candidly, that the work we had done in bringing together, and you had to cooperate as a region, which means we had to, in the political, philanthropic community, and in the business community, across the entire region, there had to be support, because otherwise you wouldn't have a choice. And to our great surprise, there really was a great sort of commonality around the Olympic Games. Now, in the Olympic world, there's this idea that sport is the common language. It breaks down all barriers. It's one of the really interesting things about why every 2 years, winter, summer, how can a warring world come together around the Olympic Games and everybody sort of put their arms down and come to compete under a fair set of rules? And so we figured if that could happen around an Olympic Games, maybe there might be a common theme around the region. And so while we all went back to our day jobs and kind of thought we were done with this, thanks to some terrific leaders like Peter Scheer and from JP Morgan and others, they convinced Ted and I and a few of the sort of carryovers from the Olympic bid that this was too important to just let it go. And so we spent most of 2015 and 16 driving around the region, talking to the business community, leadership from all over the region, including Hampton Roads, Richmond, Baltimore, across the region. And we asked CEOs, do you think something like the Greater Washington Partnership could actually make a difference? Would you sit on the board? Would you commit to real funding? And would you look at real solutions so that these artificial geographic and political boundaries, which have kept real solutions from coming to fruition, would you really commit and do that? And so today, I think we are really excited about the possibilities, because if you think about the way we have been able to organize this, by going a little bit broader than what most people think about as the Washington community, what it allows us to do is have scale. And as Jason will talk about, by defining our region north to Baltimore, south to Richmond, it's the third biggest economy in the country, seventh biggest in the world. And to the degree that scale matters, and to the degree that having a plan matters to bring in resources, and the voice of the business community, not as the voice, but as a voice that obviously impacts employment, impacts capital, impacts research and development at universities, impacts a lot of the changes that occur. To the degree that matters, our hope is that the work that we can bring forward and some of the solutions that we can bring forth can actually have outcomes that go beyond a political cycle, go beyond an earnings cycle, and obviously these are things that have very long range needs, but it has to be something that has cooperation across the board. So that's why we're here.
Great. I had this as a later question, but as you commented on it, I'll bring it up now, which is the topic of the Amazon HQ2 bid. It was something that has been coming up a couple of times in this morning's discussions. How much was Greater Washington Partnership involved or not involved in the bid process? Jason, would you like to talk about that?
Sure. Amazon, is interesting and I think mischaracterized quite a bit in terms of the opportunity. There's an overemphasis on the 50,000 jobs and the $5 billion of investment. That's a huge number. It's dramatically bigger than most corporate headquarter relocation deals, and oftentimes way too much effort and energy is put into corporate headquarter relocations. The uniqueness of Amazon for a region, particularly a region like ours, is its ability, not just because of the direct impact, but the indirect impact, to change the potential trajectory for growth, to change the industry makeups in our region. Because of that, we thought it would be important to make sure that we were showing our support. The key actors, obviously county officials, state officials, district officials, putting together specific bids for Amazon, but we felt it would be powerful to have this group say, look, we are committed to this region. We're committed to this region for the long term, and we're committed to working with Amazon to make sure that their entry into the region is a success. What we did was put together a short document. We gave that document to all the key officials bidding from this region to demonstrate that we are one region. The assets cut across the region, our strength in terms of talent is pretty unmatched when you look at what we have. Our strength in terms of research, technology, innovation is deep and unique, and we are more globally connected than any region in the world. When you put that together and you say we have a group of 21 leaders, which is our board, committed to the long-term health and vitality of the region with a near-term focus on transportation and talent, the two issues that matter the most for Amazon, we felt that that was something that mattered and something that could increase the probability of success for this region. So that was how we got involved. Obviously, there are a lot of unknowns about how this process is going to carry forward, but that's where we wanted to lean in and be supportive.
Thanks. And I think your point about talent and transportation is another one of the pervasive themes that we've been discussing and really kind of batting around points of view of there's no debate that talent is something that we want to retain, and we've got great talent here. We need to keep it here. Transportation might be one of the barriers, or it could turn into an opportunity to retain that talent along with other factors like economic housing, like innovation, like other components that take that great next generation of leaders and keep them in this area. And a lot of that, I think, really ties into the article that Doug mentioned that was in this morning's Washington Post. Folks here may have seen it. It really was talking about transportation and mobility and the idea of embarking on this ambitious program of a regional mobility blueprint. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. Look, we all know in the last conversation got at a lot of the specifics and the impact of Metro as one piece on the transportation system. Transportation is foundational to a region's economic competitiveness in a broad number of ways. Being able for people to be able to get from work to home and back, for people to be able to access a broad array of jobs, for people to be able to get to different kinds of educational and training opportunities, for small businesses to make sure that they can recruit people from a relatively broad geographic footprint and make effective and efficient decisions about where they locate. When you look at this region's transportation system, and I think it's actually pretty consistent with a lot of the aspects of this region, we have incredibly strong bones, but our muscles are at risk of atrophying. Right? Our underlying assets are quite strong, but they're not living up to their potential. What we embarked on, what we announced today, was that we're creating the first employer-led regional mobility blueprint across that entire corridor from Baltimore to Richmond, starting with an assessment of the current transportation system end-to-end, its trajectory under the status quo, and then ultimately, at the end of the process, the set of solutions that are going to be needed to transform it into the system that we need. One of the challenges that I think we face as a country, and no doubt within this region, is we've gotten to a point where we've accepted that it's really hard to improve the transportation system, so if we can just tread water, that's success. Right now, our transportation as a system is slowly degrading. In fact, if you look, and our report that we put out today demonstrates this quite clearly, our current trajectory with current funding levels, with all of the plans in place, congestion will increase by 50% over the next 2 decades. That's the trajectory we're on right now, and we know that these issues are already here today. The only way that we're going to be able to be successful at solving them is if we say, look, we need to start and recognize that people and businesses operate across the region. 50% of people in this region, Baltimore to Richmond, cross a county line when they're going from home to work. Almost 1 in 5 cross a state line between the 3 jurisdictions. That means our transportation system is fundamentally regional, and that's the scale at which we need to think about these solutions. The process that we're embarking on, the process that we launched today, where we're going to work in a broad way to develop solutions, doesn't mean you put a handful of smart people in a room and at the end they spit out the brilliant answers. A lot of these solutions have been out here we've been talking about them for 10 to 20 years. We are going to do this in a broad and open manner. We launched an RFI process, so I encourage all of you to submit your ideas. We're also going to be hosting roundtables and convenings, working with the governments and jurisdictions to really define what we need to do. And then on the back end, both our group and with a broad coalition of people, making sure that we execute. Because it's not enough to just put forward good ideas. You've got to be able to execute, and execution on this is going to be key.
Great. I think those are some important thoughts and a great call to action to the leaders in the community in the area. Why don't we open it up to a couple of questions from the group here, and then we'll wrap up at the end. Yep.
David Bowers, thanks for the comments. Question, you mentioned as you all traveled around and talked to a number of folks from Baltimore to Richmond, the issue that I had spoken about earlier about housing affordability. I'm curious, is housing affordability an issue or not that comes up with the CEOs that you all were talking with and folks in your network? And if so, are there any thoughts that GWP has about what, if anything, it might consider doing to kind of be a part of that conversation and the actions that might help address that in our region?
Well, we learned a lot by going out and meeting with folks, and we purposely assembled our voice to have, hopefully both diverse views relative to the business and the industries that they were in, as well as, where they sort of primarily, headquartered businesses worked. Although it become very clear, as Jason pointed out with the statistics, that we have a very mobile workforce and one that needs to get around and sort of expects to get around. And I think as part of our mission, we also realized that we had to focus. But I'll say specifically for Sheila Johnson, who's on our board, affordable housing is a very big issue. And I'd say among conversations among our business leadership, affordable housing is a very big issue. We have, by design, tried to focus on the two that we can do something specifically about in the short run. But I think one of the real values of partnership is that we want to actively partner with all of the great organizations, and to the degree that we can have, that we can actually get some positive leverage and bring together some ideas around specifically affordable housing. We're open to that, but we're keenly aware of, coming out of the block, we need to actually show that we can get some things done. We're not here just to be another organization, and people say to me, Russ, why do you think this organization is going to succeed? Because we have a lot of really great organizations in the region that have worked on it. And obviously we don't know. We do believe we're taking a first of its kind look by the framework and the regional approach, and really trying to have a political call to action, that it's just not good enough to stand up and say the political leadership can't work together. It just isn't. I mean, it's too important, and we want to make it so that the political leadership has to also engage, and we're all in it together. We don't know that it will work, but we do know that we think we have a framework, and I think leadership is all about process, and we hope that we can lay out a process to all of you, and we will show you that we will stick to it, and the outcome will be what the outcome is.
Jeff Kaczmarek with Prince William County, Virginia, Economic Development, and class of 2014, the best you've ever seen, Mimi.
Right.
DC, as Bob Buchanan was describing earlier, is trying to rebrand itself as something other than a federal town. And federal is not a good word right now, right? Adding Baltimore and Richmond into the equation, and perception is often reality, how does that change the brand? Have you thought about that from in that broader context that you're looking at?
Sure. So one of the interesting things in this region, and this is, true, I've lived in, from Chicago originally, I've lived in Philadelphia, Boston, the Bay Area, I've worked in Vancouver, Columbus, Ohio, New York. Every place within even one metro area has distinct cultural identities that are sometimes sub-regional. That's true here as well, and sometimes fiercely true. One of the things that's interesting when you look across that corridor, the economic growth opportunities. So if you think about what's going to define our economy and the brand of our economy going forward, the economic growth opportunities in Baltimore, the Washington area, and Richmond are remarkably similar, right? Far and away, number one is strengthening our tech sector, starting with the growth of on the commercial side of cyber activity. And number two is the broad array of assets we have across the entire corridor in life sciences. So when you actually think about, are we diluting what we have here, that corridor is much more similar in terms of economic growth opportunities than would be expected when you see some of the differences between those areas. And second, I think scale matters. Russ said this well. Scale matters when we're competing globally, when we're competing with London and different regions around Europe. I was with at an American university meeting that Iran was holding with the university from Beijing, and Beijing was talking about connecting with a location that was 162 kilometers, was on their presentation, 162 kilometers south of Beijing to strengthen because they had a similar economic corridor. That's the exact distance between Washington and Richmond. So this kind of scale and geographic connectivity, I actually think, is actually strengthens the potential as we think about how do we project ourselves as a commercial hub in addition to being a governmental and political hub globally.
And just keeping with the importance, I think, of future, not past, I think one thing that is undeniable is that there is a global competition for talent. And one of the themes that we'll hear a lot more about is this idea of mega cities, mega regions, super regions, and I really believe that the nation's capital it should be the mega region of the 21st century and beyond. But in order for us to do that, we have to truly collaborate in a way to where we earn the brand that will come as a result of that. And I actually think being the home of the federal government is a real asset, but I can tell you that certainly, a reason that we were not selected for the 2024 games was because of the home of the federal government. And I actually think that's something that we want to educate and to take on, because I actually believe it's a big asset. And I believe that every 4 years there's a new president, but the fact is the folks that make the government go stay here and make their careers and their homes and their and it's an important asset that will be here for a long, long time.
Hi, thanks for coming. Robert McNamara, board member for LGW and also the class of 2015. How are you engaging in universities? I know you've done some board work with universities here in DC. How are you engaging with universities not only to help promote the economic development, but also the retention of the influx of young people who come to study in the region and get them to stay?
Sure. Definitely one of the big assets here. We have almost 1 million people across the region, 1 million students sitting in universities. So you can think of how, we think of it in 3 different ways, right? Universities are the core, not the only, but a core piece of the talent pipeline. Universities are central to the innovation engine in the region. And then as a group that is in part trying to develop solutions, universities have deep expertise to be partners on analysis and solution development. So across all 3 of them, we happen to have one university that is also one of the largest employers in the region. As a member of our board, Ron Daniels from Johns Hopkins. But we've been looking to partner with universities on each of our efforts. So on transportation, leveraging the data and analysis, as we move into to talent with an emphasis on tech skills, defining the things that are working today, where we need to drive scale, and how, to the extent we as a coalition of major employers can be helpful in strengthening the pipeline, strengthening support for the work that's happening, and then identifying future areas for how we make sure we're getting the most out of that innovation engine, which I think it's fair to say today, given the strength of the universities we have, we're not actually making the most of what we could be delivering.
Can we get a microphone over to the front, please?
Good morning. So I'm Danielle Galeros, 2017 Nonstop. Thank you for the presentation. I was scrolling online to take a little bit look at the mobility initiative. One is just a sort of a thought. I think there's a sense that a lot of the ideas have been out there, but it strikes me that on autonomous vehicles, that is the type of game changer that will dramatically shift how we transport ourselves. And in fact, I think there was an event up in Baltimore recently And the discussion about what autonomous vehicles could or could not do for congestion is quite big. So I really hope as you're sort of digging in, we're not just looking at things and ideas that have been around for a few years, but where we are going with innovation, because it's happening so quickly. And I think that actually is one of our greatest challenges, is things are evolving very quickly. And then my question is actually more to how you think about transportation. In the Council of Governments, we spent a lot of time talking about transportation, but also that nexus with jobs and housing. We clearly have a regional imbalance here in the Washington region. That is very much the case in Baltimore. It is very much the case in Richmond. So my question is really about, how do you see equity fitting in with where you're going and what you're looking at in terms of this mega region?
Take a shot. Sure. So on transportation, and appreciate your comment on autonomous vehicles. One of the things we did in the preface document that we put out today in launching the initiative was defining 4 priorities around which we think progress is needed to deliver the kind of transportation system that the economy needs, that families in the region need. Those were connecting the super region, improving the consumer experience, ensuring equitable access, and integrating innovation, right? And your point on equity is exactly right. There are certain communities that have become disconnected from job markets, which then holds the entire economy back and harms those specific families. There's a lot of things that are happening in different parts of the country on that specific issue. Richmond's exploring that right now. So Richmond, relative to the 2 other metro areas, has a much higher concentration of jobs in the downtown, in the immediate downtown area, but increasingly certain communities have been pushed farther away, and it doesn't have a transit system like we have in the Washington area, or even one that exists in Baltimore. So the cost of car ownership effectively becomes prohibitive for some families who then can't get to where job growth is happening. That has to be part of our transportation planning. That's why we made it one of the 4 key priorities around which solutions need to be developed. And to the extent that you, the COG, and others have specifically been looking at things that have been holding back, those are places that we want to dig in.
Yep, last one.
Bob McCartney again from the Post. You issued your first report on one of your 2 big issues, which was transportation. The other big issue that you've identified that you want to address is workforce development. And I'm just wondering if you could give us a preview of sort of where you're starting on looking at how to improve workforce development, bringing in and retaining talent in the region, which so many employers say is such a huge issue for them.
So I would share a few things of note that I think are important. I really believe that every individual can make a difference, and I also believe in the power of collaboration and of ideas. And we've had 3 board meetings at the Greater Washington Partnership, and it's been just beyond exciting for me to see these like-minded individuals from different industries, different political persuasions, different sort of issues and problems, but to come together around these sort of specific ideas. And workforce, tech talent, how we think about it, what's the role of universities, how do we perhaps start to think earlier about K through 12 education and sort of go farther down in terms of, we know what the jobs are of today, and we have a pretty good idea what the jobs of the future are, but how could we do a much better job about actually having degrees, mobilizing the universities to actually think about this in a systematic way. And so, Jason has a team working on tech talent, and he can go into a couple of the specific areas that we're focused on, but I am beyond excited and enthusiastic about just what the potential 3 years out, 8 years out, 12 years out, 20 years out could look like, because there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, and then there's a lot of large sort of systematic challenges. But the ideas that we've emerged in 3 board meetings, are things that I can just tell you we've never thought about, and the power of the business leadership to actually invest capital with universities in areas that they know that they want to hire, And it is important that the big and small companies want to hire here and that they want to invest here. And that's been one of the challenges, which I think has been well written about, is the numbers and volumes of businesses that leave the region and take the jobs and the people sort of with them. You want to add to that?
I would just add two things. I mean, one of the things, when you get the folks around our table talking about what they're doing as organizations, I'm sure that's true for a number of the business leaders in this room as well. Everybody's been trying to tackle this problem on their own. And they all believe that they've identified a program that has been highly successful for their company. But when you ask the number of people that are impacted, it's like a program, it's a phenomenal thing, and it's got great outcome metrics, but it's 15 people, or it's 25 people. And when you aggregate all those 15 and 25 people programs together, that's far short of the scale that we know is needed in the region. So how do you step back and, as Russ said, in a systematic way, identify first the things that are working and where you can have scale on those programs in a significant way, so it's not one major employer and a partnership with one community college, but actually driving it across the region. Second thing is, we're gonna, from a workforce standpoint, dig in on tech talent first. It's the largest growing sector, largest potential growing sector. We are losing share of tech workers compared to other regions. We have a large production pipeline of tech talent in the region, yet the gap between supply and demand is larger here than the country on average, and it's growing. And as a number of people have said, we have a retention challenge. We're losing millennials, and we're losing people with tech backgrounds to other parts of the country, despite the large potential demand here. So digging in that space is where we're going to be looking first.
Great. Jason, Russ, thank you both so much for your time. It's been really helpful and enlightening to not only hear about your vision, but also the roadmap and the aspirations to get us there. So thank you very much for your time. Please help me in thanking Jason and Russ. Thank you.